As the world fell, each of us in our own way was broken. It was hard to know who was more crazy. Me or everyone else.
Hello and welcome once again to the Cine-Files, where each week we enter the world of a great film. We explore its themes, the history, the filmmaking, and the influence it has on us today. My name is Steve Morris, and I'm a filmmaker and directing instructor in Los Angeles, California.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Rocha. I'm a writer, producer, and host, voiceover artist here in San Diego, California, and I'm incredibly excited to start off with our second movie of 2025 with something like this, one of my favorite films. And I'm excited to talk about it with you, Steve, but also with our guest.
Absolutely. We are thrilled to welcome back to the Cine-Files microphones the producer of one of the great podcasts of all time, WTF with Marc Maron. We have Brendan McDonald. Welcome back to the Cine-Files.
Oh, thank you, Steve and John. You're too kind. I should say this is a lot of pressure to be invited back for this. Like, this is like being invited to be in the wedding party after one nice double date. You get asked to come back and talk about Fury Road. Jeez.
Listen, when you have a wonderful first date, I say, why wait? Just jump right into a relationship.
Exactly. You are awaited in Valhalla, and we needed you to come with us.
Well, I'm glad you witnessed me here.
Well, this all came really because of you, because when we first reached out to you and you sent us a list of 10 movies, the other one we were debating doing was Mad Max Fury Road, and we had our meeting with our incredible advisory board, which you can join by going to patreon.com/the Cine-Files, where you also could get ad-free versions of the show, as well as listen to our Cine-Files shorts. And we're talking to our advisory board about how to kick off 2025. And the overwhelming response is, you guys got to do Fury Road. Yeah. And John and I immediately looked at each other and it's like, we might have a guest for that.
And another way you can support the show, not just by joining the Patreon, is when you hear the ads and you hear, Steve and I talking, or the pre-programmed ads, and you like the products they're offering, and make sure you use the code for the Cine-Files so that you can benefit from using the products, but also help us with benefits by having those clients come back and keep supporting us because they see you guys using their products.
And I guess we should just jump right into, and I'm just going to reveal this to the audience, to the listeners. There are shows that are difficult to prepare for. There's shows that are easier to prepare for. I cannot think of a movie that has been as difficult to prepare for as Mad Max Fury Road. We have to go back to like The Godfather or something. Like, that's how much, and I'm going to say it right off the bat. This is one of the great films of all time. It might very well be the greatest action movie ever made. I am putting that out there right here at the beginning.
Yeah, I want to follow that up with saying, I think if you can consider this series finished, if they are indeed not going to make any more, then I think it is indisputably the greatest film franchise of all time. Wow. In the sense that it is 5-0, right? All very good to masterpiece films. No bad ones, all unique, all standalone, and yet connected. You can't find that anywhere else.
Wow, that's a strong statement. I have to really kind of assess that, because I think the third one is the weakest of the five, yet you can argue that it's still a damn good movie. And
I actually put that as third in my rankings of these films. Really? So, and in that sense, I think it's great.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
I probably wouldn't put it that high. I think, but for me, it's like it is half amazing.
Yeah.
And half is fine. Like that's kind of how I feel about Thunderdome.
We'll see what happens with the fifth Toy Story film. If that comes out and it's fantastic, then you've got yourselves a hell of a battle. Mad Max versus Toy Story.
That's a pretty good 5 for 5. Yeah.
Right. If they nail it. Yeah, for sure.
Now I'm just picturing a battle between Woody and Buzz and Matt in the Mad Max world. I think this is someone's really got to work on this. This will be exciting. Brendan, I'll start with you. How did you first come to Mad Max Fury Road? And let me ask this additional question as well. how did you first come to the franchise of Mad Max?
Well, Mad Max, as of this year turns, or I should say Mad Max as of last year turned 45 years old, which makes it the same age as me. I turned 45 last year as well. So Mad Max has been around my entire lifetime. When I was a kid, I remember the original Mad Max being on TV, and I could immediately tell it was dubbed, and I thought it was junk. Because, you saw, treated it like a Hercules movie or something where it had, actors with their lip flap thing going on, and the dialogue wasn't matching. And so I didn't care about it. I didn't register it. And that was probably around the same time that Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome was coming out in theaters, 1985. And so I associated more as like whatever that Mad Max thing was that they made in Australia, that was like junky B-movie garbage. And this was what the Hollywood version of it was. And because of that, it was indistinguishable to me of everything else that was kind of like fantasy oriented when I was a kid, like whether it was like the Conan movies or Sword and Sorcerer or something like that, and Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Those are all of a piece in my, young child brain. I do remember seeing it. I do remember liking it for whatever you like something for when you're a kid. But that was about like as far as I went with it. And I had never seen as a young kid the Road Warrior, probably because it was inappropriate for a kid my age. I think it was probably around like in my 20s that I just heard enough of like Mad Max 2, Road Warrior, blah, 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 people just talking it up as this great film, and just watched it one night. Like, yeah, I guess I really should watch this. Everybody talks it up. And of course, loved it and realized like, oh my God, what have I been missing? And then went back and, revisited the entire series and loved it in the way that you do when you can appreciate it as an older person. And so that was my full experience with it. I didn't go kind of beyond that until 2015 rolls around. I didn't really care that they were making a new Mad Max. I wasn't like geared up for it. It wasn't one of my favorite things, but I knew it would be quality because I had maybe 10 years before watched The Road Warrior for the first time. And I apologize to people out there. I'm just going to keep calling it The Road Warrior. I know it's called Mad Max 2, but like in America, it was The Road Warrior, and that's the cooler name. Like, that's why the wrestlers were the Road Warriors, because it's cool.
Yeah.
And so, that there was this sense like, oh, well, you're going to get your money's worth going to see this. I was excited to see it. I saw all the trailers and the ads for it. It looked great. I think it's the first movie I can remember first and only movie probably in the last 20 years that I saw, and it gave me the feeling of watching something anew as a child. Like, it gave me a sense of total awe and wonder and just a magnificent transportation without nostalgia. Like, it was divorced from something that had existed in my past or existed in my childhood. It was a new feeling of like sitting in there and within the first 15 minutes of this movie being like, I am in a world right now that did not exist 15 minutes before when I stepped into this theater. And I remember I saw it about 3 or 4 times in the theater. And then I think it's the movie I have seen the most in the last 10 years. Like of anything I've watched over and over again, this is definitely the one I've watched the most times in the past 10 years.
Yeah.
No. John, how about you? How did you come to the Mad Max franchise and to Fury Road?
I'll tell you, the things that people who've listened to me or listened to me on my other shows when I talk about my life and my breakdown as a young kid, like, to me, there was always this battle between this guy who gravitated to these physical type movies like Stallone and Schwarzenegger and this sensitive guy, right? And so here comes this movie out of nowhere, Mad Max, when I was a kid. And back when I was a kid, you rented betas and VHSs at the store. And I remember like this was the movie Mad Max. You got to get your dad to rent Mad Max for you, the first film, because it's rated R and it was in the theaters. And I remember that my dad gave in. I think it was 12 years old when I saw this movie, or 13 years old when I saw this movie for the first time. And then that movie kind of just messed me up.
Which one? Is it Mad Max?
Mad Max, the first film. I call it the Road Warrior. That's what it is. We've established that. The second film is Road Warrior. You've done that, Brendan, so that's what it is. But Mad Max, Road Warrior, Fury Road, Furiosa, these are the order of these things. But like with Mad Max, the first film, that's the one I saw on VHS, I think it was. And I remember just being absolutely messed up by that movie because of what happens to, is it Goose or his friend that
Goose,
gets burnt? Yeah. And what happens to, I remember the visual of that stuck with me as strongly as it did with what's his face dying One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest near the end. Okay, it's just one of those things you always remember. So it's not a film I went back to. Plus, what happens to his wife and his child was heartbreaking. So as I've told you, Steve, before, my father was a house painter. He used to paint houses as an immigrant in exchange for these old people, in exchange for whatever they wanted to give him, so he could get practice being a house painter. Well, one of those things I've talked about, my legendary box of VHS and betas that this old person gave to my father. One of those was Road Warrior. And I watched Road Warrior at home about 3 million times. Like, it was one of those things, that Rocky 3, Wildcats, and I think there's one other film that Broadcast News, that I would just watch on repeat all the time. It's what began like kind of my love, the beginnings of my love of film. And Road Warrior became what Holy Grail becomes to nerds. I knew every line of Road Warrior back to front. I would wake up saying some of the lines. I would use the lines in conversation. And by the way, I'm a fat, doughy nerd with a bowl haircut, but this film spoke to me in so many ways. And so Mad Max has been such a strong, integral part of my existence. So when all these years later they talked about Fury Road, it was at Comic-Con that we snuck into Hall H through a security guard and a connection with Brian Leonard. We got in just in time to see the visuals and the presentation of Fury Road, and my jaw went through the floor all the way to China. I could not believe what I was seeing on the screen, and that George Miller, all these years later, could come back and deliver a film like that, because I wasn't the biggest fan of Thunderdome, even though I love Tina Turner, I love Master Blaster and all of that. It just didn't quite 100% get there for me. But when Fury Road came, when I saw the visuals in Hall H, I was like, this is it. And when I saw the movie, which I think was just with a bunch of us on opening night, I remember just sitting back going, like, this is my cocaine. This is my absolute greatest franchise that I thoroughly love. And the visuals here from George Miller, the story itself, although it's very like violent, action-packed and violence and all of that, there's also a heart to it. And that's the best of the Mad Max movies. Each one of them has a heart to it, about saving somebody, about revenge, about righting a wrong, and Max is in service of it. He's the reluctant hero in service. It's very reminiscent of Bruce Lee, the reluctant hero who gets dragged into this stuff. And so for me, Mad Max has always been it's almost like Rocky. It has that resonant part from the beginning. And I loved Fury Road, and I'm with Brendan. I've seen this movie a million times. Loved re-exploring it again on 4K for our conversation. So yeah, I'm excited to jump in and talk about this movie. What about you, Steve?
So for me, I don't know, there must have been an adult who took me, because I went to see it in the theater. I saw Road Warrior in the theater at the San Rafael when it came out, and I remember sitting in the balcony, and it was just like because as a nerdy comic book sci-fi kid, there weren't a lot of movies that put on the screen some of the things I was reading about in books. And this was like one of those moments that just completely electrified me. And it's just, as both of you said, there was a VHS tape, and we rented it a lot, and all of that, saw it, Road Warrior over and over again, then went back to see Mad Max. And of course, I'm in high school when Thunderdome comes out. I think I saw it 3 times in the theater. I thought it was just awesome. And so I was a huge fan of that. And then we finally get, to 2015. And this is in the era where I didn't go to see a lot of movies because I had a kid. And Karen and I dropped Jackson. He had just started preschool. And we dropped him off at preschool, and we drove to Burbank to the AMC and sat in the recliners to watch this movie. Wow. And I had it's funny, until you said it, Brendan, I didn't have this connection. But there is an experience I had when I watched Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon, that when I was 9 years old with my dad, and I remember standing up because it was like electricity was going over my entire body. And that was the experience I had when I discovered Jackie Chan. And I would have this feeling, like this physical feeling. That's how Fury Road made me feel. Like it is as visceral a movie as I can think of. And it is absolutely overwhelming and electrifying. Like there is no experience in my mind that is akin to Fury Road.
And I got to say this, Steve, it's that way today. Like, I was amazed that I could watch this movie, which I've never written it down, but I got to guess. I've seen this, if like I say, 10 years, I've probably seen it. I've definitely watched it at least once a year. And there've probably been some years I've watched it multiple times. So let's say I've seen this movie 15 times. That's I think, a conservative guess, because I'll watch it on an airplane. I'll watch it whenever it's available to me. I will watch it. And so let's say I've seen this 15 times. I watched it for the 15th time, and it was just as good as new.
Yeah. There's literally nothing like it. I really think that this is as fascinating. And it's funny, too. Something that's come up many times on the podcast is that there are movies that are great stories, and then there are movies that have great stories behind the scenes. And then there are these few movies that manage to have these incredible dramas behind the scenes and end up being a great film. Obviously, Citizen Kane, Jaws, Godfather, these are movies like this. Apocalypse Now, so's Fury Road.
Yeah, this one's like a miracle. When you hear the story, you can't believe it got made, let alone it's as great as it is.
Yeah. So I want to talk about George Miller just a little bit as we get going. He's born in 1945 in Queensland, Australia. And what I have always forgotten about him is that he is a fucking doctor. He is a board certified physician who was working as a doctor when he made a short film that won an award, and he decided, I don't want to do this doctor thing. I actually want to be a filmmaker. I mean, that origin story alone is fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he apparently funded the remnants of the original Mad Max by pulling some shifts, right? He did some shifts with his brother. They were basically like, I don't know what you'd call it, but like highway patrol doctors, like they were there to do like emergency services on car wreck victims.
Well, that is a huge part of the origin stories of Mad Max is that he's essentially like a high-level EMT, and there's so few regulations in Australia at the time and so little safety, and nobody's wearing seatbelts, that he's just cleaning up wrecks every single night. And it's the violence of car crashes that is part of the inspiration for Mad Max. And as you say, this is how he paid for Mad Max. And he's making it, and we told this story, I should say, by the way, that we did do Mad Max The Road Warrior with our special guest and one of my best friends, Steve Jones, was on. We're going to be re-releasing that. And we talked about this story then, but I'm going to repeat it now, which is he didn't know a lot about making movies. They shoot the movie. They run out of money. And basically the producers say, well, I guess we just have to release whatever we have. And he goes, no, I'm going to keep editing it. And so basically for a year, sitting alone in his kitchen at night while he's doing doctor work in the day, George Miller is editing Mad Max. And that to him is film school. Like that is where because he learned everything that he didn't know, like everything that he didn't shoot, everything he didn't understand while filming. Because when you're editing, you go, man, I really need a close up or a reverse angle or this piece of storytelling. And he didn't have it. And that's where it taught him. And he goes to one of the other great Australian directors, Peter Weir. And basically, because he's in the midst of post and it's just terrible and nothing's working. And he's going, I think can't be a filmmaker because everything was a disaster and there are all these reversals. And Peter Weir basically is like, yeah, it's always that hard. That's what filmmaking is. Filmmaking is about pushing forward disaster after disaster when you're really not in control of the process and seeing it through to the end. And that's what helped George Miller finish that first version of Mad Max.
It reminded me of, we just recently had Robert Zemeckis on WTF. And there was something, Mark had just watched Who Framed Roger Rabbit, was just, like rapturously talking about it with Zemeckis. And he asked him, I can't remember if it was specifically about that, but it was something he was like, man, that must have been a lot of fun. And Zemeckis was like, no. He said, these movies are fun to watch. They're not fun to make. And like, he was very clear. Like it wasn't something he had to deliberate.
This is the thing that came up in film school all the time because students, I think if you say, I want to be a mathematician, you probably have a good understanding of math and what it entails, like being a mathematician. If you're going to be a doctor, an accountant, a lawyer, like people watch famous people on talk shows or they go to see movies and they watch the Oscars and they go, oh, that's what movies are like. And it's like, no, making movies has nothing to do with the experience of watching movies.
Right.
It is making movies, and Fury Road is a perfect example. Making movies is terrible.
Yeah, to the point where its stars were like, what the hell is this thing? We hate it until they saw it.
Yeah.
But you also have to factor in the fact that he keeps coming back to make these, right? Even though they are difficult to make, they are tough to make. They're tough on the actors, tough on everybody involved in the production, and out in that dust, out in that wasteland, all those things that can go wrong with equipment and what have you. But he keeps coming back to it. And maybe the fact that he was a doctor who dealt with a lot of difficult things and tough things to come to fix and to come to the end of helping someone, this is something that comes second nature to him, even though it may be difficult. And so I find that to be fascinating because, yeah, he did Babe and stuff, but you don't catch him doing a lot of rom-coms. Like, he's gravitating to this kind of stuff. And he was going to do a Justice League. Remember that situation as well. So I think he likes challenges. And so that speaks volumes about George Miller and the way he approached things as a director.
Absolutely. And so obviously Mad Max comes out. It is a huge hit for its budget. It is still proportionally one of the biggest, most successful movies of all time. Then Road Warrior, even bigger hit. And then he starts to work within the studio system. And he makes Mad Max 3 in the studio system. He does Witches of Eastwick. George Miller, not a good, he doesn't play in the system that well. Like, he doesn't like it, which I understand. He doesn't like the system. He wants to do what he wants to do. And so he started to have a lot of conflicts. But 2 years after he finishes Thunderdome, he already has the idea for Fury Road. And it's the basic idea is, I want to do a continuous chase. That was the first part of it. And then he even had some of the themes, like ideas of these young men with cancer who need blood transfusions and their susceptibility to strong leaders. Like, a lot of that is percolating literally 30 years before he makes the movie.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I should say that a lot of my knowledge of not just Fury Road, but the Mad Max series and of George Miller comes from the excellent book, Blood, Sweat, and Chrome, The Wild and True Story of Mad Max Fury Road, and that's by Kyle Buchanan, which I really loved that book and devoured it, and highly recommend anyone who even has passing enjoyment of this one movie or the whole series, definitely read that book or listen to the audiobook. It's really great. It's basically an oral history of the lifespan of Mad Max. And one of the things that shocks me in that book is how clear they were on the premise of Fury Road from the earliest points. To the point where they sit and have a story session about it and basically storyboard the whole thing out. And this is around like 1998. And everyone who was involved in that meeting says, yeah, that's about 80% of what's on the finished film that you see now. Like, it lasted that long through its gestation period.
I think there's two things that are really interesting about it. And by the way, thank you for plugging that book, because of course I listened to it, and that's where a lot of my notes comes from too. It is fantastic and super enjoyable for anybody who is interested in this film. I think what's so interesting is that, because this is a movie that gets almost made and delayed and almost made and delayed multiple times over a couple of decades, or over a decade at least. And I think they both had a huge amount of the movie, the ideas of the movie, very early on. And all of those delays serve to make the movie much, much better.
Totally.
Because each time when he is on to another project, he keeps coming back and he keeps revising and he keeps changing things as he's moving forward. I had no idea, speaking of Zemeckis, that he was supposed to make Contact.
George Miller was.
Mm-hmm.
George Miller was.
Wow,
he spent years developing Contact until that all fell apart. He gets fired and Zemeckis gets brought in. And this sounds like this is one of the huge things that soured him on the studio system and working with them. But in this process, and I don't quite understand the sequence of events, but he ended up suing Warner Brothers, and he got all the rights back to the character of Mad Max. That came under his control. That's in the early 90s. And now it comes up, hey, let's make a Mad Max TV show. Yeah. And this was literally announced in 1995 that there's going to be a Mad Max TV show. They're developing toys. Miller is working with toy companies. And at this time, a comic book artist named Brendan McCarthy essentially reaches out to George Miller, and they have a meeting. And then George Miller, and he sounds like he does this a lot. If he meets with you and he likes you, he will keep you around. You know, he's very, very loyal. And he starts talking with Brendan McCarthy, who is a huge, huge fan of Road Warrior, or of Mad Max. And Brendan's like, why do you want to do a TV show? You should really do a movie. And he pitches this idea about Max delivering a package of human sperm to continue the human race.
Oh my God.
Which again, though, is connected to the wives and the ideas of where the movie is going to go.
And he basically delivers it to the Citadel. Like, that's what it sounds like when they describe it.
Yeah. Meanwhile, George Miller has produced and co-written this little family film called Babe.
Yeah.
Which my brain connecting Mad Max and Babe, and this is the same guy. That's kind of amazing. And Babe, obviously, it's a huge hit. There is no Mad Max Fury Road without Babe.
Oh,
and there probably is no Mad Max Fury Road without Happy Feet.
Mm-hmm.
Like these two family-centric George Miller projects are what makes them one of the craziest action movies possible. So he starts going back to work on Fury Road, and here is one of the many craziest things about this movie. And this is, I think, in a lot of ways, this is an experimental film. This is a film, it's not just what's on the screen that's totally unique, but the way they made the film is totally unique. The approach of the film, step by step, all the way through the casting, through the way the sets are designed, through the way the props are made, where your actors are worked with, everything is different from the traditional way of making a film. And this is the first one, and maybe the most important, which is there is no script. Nobody wrote a script.
Oh my God.
This movie is entirely written through storyboards.
Wow.
So they had the Mad Max room at George Miller's office, and Brendan McCarthy and other people who came in would talk through the story. Brendan would draw things up. George would have these little drawings, and he would place them essentially pre-editing, pre-visualizing the movie on the walls and moving shots around. And that is the script. The script is this room filled with eventually over 3,500 drawings.
And I think you basically, through that, get the technical proficiency of the film as it, it had this place to anchor it on the, like, they're talking about going through meetings with Mel Gibson back in, 2002 or whatever, and they're showing them all the same storyboards that last them through up till 2010, 2012, when they're actually shooting the film. It's that idea that 80% of this lasted throughout. It's because they had this visual template. Now, the other 20% I think is equally as important. And I don't know if you're going to get to this right here, Steve, but there's this guy he brings in, Nico Lathuris, who was an actor and a guy he started to, trust as like a confidant. And this guy is like his in-house dramaturg. Yep. And basically everyone is in agreement that, like, if they all say, like, 80% of it wound up on the screen, from start to finish, that extra 20% was Nico. And it was him reaching into the guts of this thing and extracting the heart, right? And coming out with the real soul of this film just by working over and over and over and over again these story beats. What's the emotional truth here? Where are you getting with this? Where does this character go? Where does this happen? It's just, as you're saying, Steve, it's this real iterative experimental process that you wouldn't be the same movie without it.
Yeah, it's fascinating because to me, when you look at this approach, right? No script, and you're asking these people to buy in, and you've got this room. How do you pitch it? How do you sell it? It's a challenge, as you said. It's unusual. And I will say, the final end product of this movie is one of the most unusual films ever made. Still, 10 years later, when you watch it, just the way he shoots it, the rapidity of some of the scenes, all the stuff that he does, messing with the pace, it's incredible, right? And the visuals, of course, are certainly stunning. But to do this without a script initially and kind of move within that and challenge yourself in that way, again, as I said, George Miller is a director who clearly loves to challenge himself. Being from that continent, and that continent definitely has the energy of like, we like the hard way. We'll do it the hard way. We have no problem with it. I like that energy of it all. But again, it's not easy to do because if you remember David Milch, there was a lot of that near the end of Deadwood, near the end of NYPD Blue, where he was just lying on the set and coming up with script pages while his assistant was typing out the script pages at the same time. The actors got them from like an hour ahead of time and then had to do the scenes. Some actors thrive in that situation. Some actors don't, because you elevate the stress level of actors. And certainly some of them enjoyed it on Deadwood and some of them didn't. And I wonder if that might have been an element that caused some of the friction here between Charlize and Hardy that has been legendarily spoken about for years and chronicled for years. So I love that idea that it was just no script. Let's see what we can create. And as you said, Brendan, with Nico coming in and go like, okay, but we got to give them something to hold on to, which I think was great.
Well, I think without, I mean, like in any movie, every single element becomes necessary for the whole. And this one in particular, there's so many things that have to go right. And I think one of the I won't say the geniuses of George Miller. I'll say one of the great things about his character as him as a human being is that he has faith that he will work it out, that they will work it out. He has faith in the people that he's working with. He has faith in the project, and he knows they're literally driving off a cliff. I mean, literally in this movie, driving off a cliff. And he is continually going, we're going to work this out. This is fun. I was going to say this later, but I'll say it right now, which is that there are three themes that really came to me that I realized the more that I thought about them, they're all kind of pieces of the same theme. And one of them is the emphasis in this film on process versus product. Is that it was always about working the process and finding it was never about this is the vision and we must create it. It was always this process they wanted to go through. The second thing is, and this is something that came from a theater professor that I had at Cal, is that he said at one point in a class, like, look, people think that if they can come up with one good idea, like I'm going to do Shakespeare in Nazi Germany, that's all you need. And he said a good play is 10,000 good ideas. There's no movie that exemplifies that more. And it's not 10,000. It's like 100,000. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's like literally in every shot, you could stop it and see 50 good ideas. And this leads the third piece of this that I think these are all related is that you can be a true visionary and simultaneously be a true collaborator. Is that George Miller got genius to come out of all of these people and was thrilled about them all creating things. And that's where these thousands of good ideas come from. And that all comes from process. He worked the process over and over again for, like we said, over a decade to make this movie. and
to show what a crapshoot that is and how there's no guarantee that it would work, I'll throw a name out there, you guys. Francis Ford Coppola. You know that guy? He's pretty good, right? He's made some good movies.
I listened, by the way, so I'm a subscriber to the Full Marin, which is Brendan's the bonus feeds that you get, and I listened to you talk about Megaopolis.
Yeah.
I have not seen it.
I mean, like, look, we don't have to tap dance on that movie. Like, I part of me is like, more power to you. You funded it with your winery. It's great. Like, that's what you should do in your old age or whatever. But like, that's another movie that had a very long gestation period. It was thought of hundreds and probably thousands of ideas over the course of 40 years, and it doesn't come together at all. In fact, it's kind of embarrassing. It's an interesting experiment, and I'm not going to tell anyone not to see it. It's definitely a unique experience, but I can never say it's a successful film. I can watch Fury Road and feel every minute of it being deliberated over many hours, days, years. It reminds me of those Raiders of the Lost Ark story sessions that I don't know if you've ever seen or heard those with Lucas and Spielberg and Lawrence Kasdan, just sitting around talking about this idea of Indiana Jones. And it's hours long of them just, enjoying the exploration of what this character can be and what they think they should. And you can hear them talk about things that wind up in other movies that have nothing to do with Indiana Jones. But that's what you feel in this Mad Max Fury Road. You feel those 40 years or however long it was of him developing this, which, it's almost 40 years if you're talking about it going back to Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome.
Yeah. I just want to touch on Coppola just really briefly, because you're 100% right. Because the thing is we could say exactly the same thing about Megaopolis that you say about Apocalypse Now, which is he put it, he almost bankrupted himself to finish the movie. It's all experimental. He's playing with his ideas, and that movie is a masterpiece. And Megaopolis clearly is not, So you're right. It is 100% a crapshoot. Back to our origin story of this film. So the big question,
we're going to get to the film. We promise you. At some point we're going to get to the film.
We got a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff to deal with. So of course the big question is, we're developing the new Mad Max movie. Is Mel Gibson going to be in it? Yeah. And Mel Gibson in 1995 has just won the Oscar for Best Picture against Babe, beating Babe. And George isn't sure that he wants it to be Mel Gibson. He's talking about Brad Pitt. He's talking about Johnny Depp.
Wow.
And the studio, of course, is saying, no, it has to be Mel Gibson, particularly right after Braveheart. We're at peak Mel at this moment. And Mel is prepping for Passion of the Christ, and he goes to meet George. And as we said, He goes to this room. They spent 3 days together walking around the storyboard room, looking at all of it. In the end, Mel is 100% on board. He loves it. But he goes, look, I'm turning 50, and we got to get to this movie right away. At this point, George Miller, as you mentioned before, John, is prepping for Justice League.
Yeah, Justice League, yeah.
With Armie Hammer as Batman, Adam Brody as Barry Allen, Megan Gale, who will play Valkyrie in this movie, as Wonder Woman. Yeah. And that collapses. And so now he's back on Fury Road. And they get a green light. And this movie, now we're in the early 2000s, and it's going to be made with Mel Gibson and possibly Sigourney Weaver as Furiosa.
Ooh. Interesting. Okay.
Budget's $104 million, which even then seemed like that was going to be impossible. There was talk of, at some point, there was talk of shooting this movie in black and white. And I don't know when that got dumped, but they're not shooting in black and white. They started to build cars in 2003. So in 2003, they have, and we'll get into the cars as we go forward, but in 2003, they had set up a place. They're already building cars and props. One person that auditioned to be a war boy, maybe even auditioned for Nux, although I'm not sure, is Tom Hardy.
Oh, wow.
Which I think is crazy.
Yeah.
And then we're in the post 9/11 world. The Iraq war has started. The US dollar has collapsed against the Australian dollar, and people don't think about this, but like suddenly the budget is 25% more expensive because of just the monetary exchange. And then Mel Gibson gets pulled over for a ticket. And we all know the controversies that happen around Mel Gibson. But and at the same time, George Miller had some health problems. I think he had heart problems. And so all of these things combined to put the movie on hold. And by the time they're ready to go again, Mel Gibson is out and they have to recast.
Now, is he out by his own decision or by the studio's decision because of the controversy around
the studio
arrest? Yeah.
Yeah, I believe it is the studio.
Well, and as far as I know from the timeline of it too, it was like the money situation bottomed out first, right?
Yeah.
So they were already like, we can't go forward with this now. And when you're in that situation, as you guys know, it's like you either just abandon it and move on, or you try to keep it going. You try to keep it alive. And in that book, they talk about everybody who was involved with it was always like, but there's a spark, right? Like we got something here. We could keep it going. And every time they had that spark of keeping it going, something else would happen to set it back. And in that case was like, first the money, studio saying we're not going to be able to fund this against the US dollar. And then Gibson not being available for it. So it's just like one thing after another saying, you will not make this movie.
Yeah.
And strangely enough, though, and I don't understand how this happened budgetarily, but they kept building cars. Like there still is some funds in the budget for this crew in Sydney that's just building wacky vehicles. So that's still going on. And every time George has a break, he and the writers and storyboard people are going back and refining the story. And then it's 2006 and Happy Feet is a big hit.
Yeah.
And so George he's heard about, Spielberg, who made Jurassic Park and Schindler's List at the same time. He said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make Happy Feet 2 and Mad Max Fury Road simultaneously. This got shut down immediately.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Thank God. It's just that's insane. So they're still building cars. It's now 2006. They've been building cars and stuff for 4 or 5 years now. Finishes Happy Feet 2, and suddenly it's 2007 and Fury Road is a possibility again. He casts Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy in 2007. We'll come back to their casting a little later. And this movie is scheduled to start shooting in early 2011. Yeah. They're even at the time talking about making 2 movies back to back, Fury Road and Furiosa, because at this point they've developed the whole backstory for Furiosa and her whole journey. So they're talking about doing that, and they're going to shoot in New South Wales at a place called Broken Hills. And this is a very desert, barren, empty space, which will be great for Fury Road, except they had the rainiest rainy season in the history of the area. And suddenly there are beautiful wildflowers blooming everywhere. They're like, we can't shoot Mad Max here. This is not going to work. And so again, they're shut down.
Wow.
They didn't start shooting for a full year and a half later in July of 2012.
Jesus, that's a lot.
Again, there's no script, which is everything works based on a script in movie making. It is central to how you do everything. The movie is almost entirely nonverbal. They have 3,500 storyboard panels, and they go off to film in the middle of fucking nowhere in Namibia.
Oh, wow. Namibia. Okay.
Yeah. And when I say it's the middle of nowhere, this is really the middle of nowhere. There's like, and they're there for 7 months. And there's like a little small town. It has like 2 restaurants and 1 bar, and that is all there is. And it isn't even a very safe place. Like there's just constant crime. Like actors are not allowed to go anywhere by themselves. Like this is real off the beaten path. So, shall we get into Mad Max Fury Road?
Oh,
yeah, we're in the desert. We're starting right there in the wasteland, so we might as well.
So we start with that rusty, bleeding Warner Brothers logo, and already I'm in.
My name is Max. My world is fire and blood.
And then we get, which we have before, this sort of montage of the whatever the apocalypse was, the nuclear war that ended civilization. We get a little bit of that.
It's always great that it's always just a little bit. Like that's one of the real prized points of this whole franchise is that he never lets you see more than a little bit of what happened, because ultimately it is not the story. The story is what's after, and all you need to know is that it happened.
Because, I mean, in the past, you've had that, right? In Road Warrior, you have the narrator, which was the little kid, and all of that. So you've had that in the past with Road Warrior films, right? So to have this situation, and look, sometimes you can watch movies with headphones or with subtitles, and it's a whole nother experience. I watch it this time with subtitles as I'm getting older, and I don't mind admitting that. And seeing the dialogue that just kind of floated by me, and the many times I'd watched it before, seeing what they're actually saying about the water and about the certain areas and whatever, it's a great way to lay the groundwork of exposition for what's gone on before this film starts, right? And so I think it's really smart. And hearing the rev of that motor over the logo immediately lets you know, look, we're not slow walking into this. We are going right full tilt from the beginning, get on board or get off. And I like that opening overall while you're hearing these voices tell you about what went on in the past and how much of this is connected to Max, how much of this is about the world. It's all just kind of nebulous in the way it's being presented, but all of it is in essence trying to lay the groundwork for what went on all these years between Thunderdome and Fury Road.
As the world fell, each of us in our own way was broken. It was hard to know who was more crazy, me or everyone else.
That's a nice bit of writing. I know there's not a lot of dialogue in this movie, but what is there is good, you know?
Well, I also think it's very important that the voiceover we hear is Max, and that is the only voiceover you hear in this film. That's really important to the series. And this is why, because Miller has explained the continuity of the series as essentially a bunch of folk tales. Like his explanation for this is a whole series of like a bunch of stories that kids somewhere deep in the wasteland would be sitting around and telling. You know, much like at the end of Thunderdome, they're doing that in this new society they're trying to create. You see that where the voiceover actually gets actualized in a communal setting. This is what you're hearing, and they've told this story of the visitor, and he came through. They're all myths and folklore. And so they all have different tones and different perspectives and no real continuity to speak of. That's why you have like different actors or the same actors playing different roles in different movies. It's a pastiche of what, you know, memory recalls in this environment. And I also think that accounts for how the movies hit you differently as a viewer. But I find it really important that the only voiceover in this film is Max, because it's almost as if to say, he's telling a story here of a real hero. That real hero is not him. It's someone else.
Right. Great point.
And if you think back to the very first movie, there's a little monologue by his chief, Fifi. Yep. And Fifi tells him when Max comes to him and says, I'm out, I'm quitting. He saw what happened to his partner. He got burned alive. He says, I'm quitting. And Fifi says, the world needs heroes, Max, and we got to give it to him. Right? Like, that's ultimately the whole theory of why this is a series, right? It's like the hero story. In fact, for Miller himself, this series didn't get out of the blocks for him until he really devoted himself to the Joseph Campbell hero myth, right? He said between making Mad Max and making The Road Warrior, he studied a lot of Campbell and started to get the idea of the universal hero much more clearly. That was part of what you were talking about, Steve, of how he felt he was going through film school there. He was identifying what he did wrong in that first movie. And one of those things he thought was story. I didn't narrowly enough define the hero. And here, not only has he gotten now through 3 movies, as he opens the 4th movie, he is telling you, I am giving you a different hero. And the guy who was the hero in the past ones, he's telling you the story. He is going to tell you through his perspective a story of this hero.
I think that is an amazing point. I'd never heard that idea of that these are the folk tales told years later. It makes so much sense, because what's so interesting is, like, in every other franchise beloved by geeks, there is constant discussion of what you got wrong in the continuity. So there's constantly debates of, like, well, what, if he made C-3PO, why doesn't he recognize, like all of those things that geeks argue about. None of those happen in Mad Max movies.
They don't matter.
They don't matter. It doesn't. There isn't continuity. There is an ethos. There is a feeling of a Mad Max movie, but there isn't any particular rules, and it's because of just what you said. Oh, these are just myths.
Yeah. Well, and in my head canon, that's why this Mad Max is a different actor. It's almost like, oh, this is the real Mad Max. Like, this is what the guy really is like, and he's telling this story. And then those other 3 movies, that was the mythic version of him, right? That's what the stories that have been passed down. And it looks like Mel Gibson. In this, you're seeing like the real guy, and it's a different looking guy because he's the narrator.
Well, and speaking of seeing him, we're going to see him right now, because we've been in the black and just watching these images for a long time. And now we cut to the first of 1,000 amazing shots.
It's beautiful.
It's just so good. It's his car, the Mad Max, Ford Interceptor, and it is him just carry back to us, peeing over this incredible golden expanse of a wasteland in front of him.
Yeah.
And then we hear this little girl's voice.
Hello? Where are you? Where are you, Mom?
Here they come again, worming their way into the black matter of my brain.
This is a different Mad Max. This guy's hearing voices. He looks real. He looks like he has gone way farther around the bend than the Raggedy Man that we saw in Thunderdome.
He might be mad.
I think he's mad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love this as an intro, right? Because we're at a stage when this film comes out in 2015 where we're having more conversations about mental health and about things, thoughts in our heads, and about things that affect us, right? You wouldn't necessarily have gotten this with Mad Max in the previous iterations in the 80s and late 70s. But this is a Mad Max that's much more contemplative. This is a Mad Max that is dealing with these issues. So it immediately makes him vulnerable. It immediately makes him connectable as a protagonist, one of the protagonists in this movie. We think, if we're watching it for the first time, he is going to be the main protagonist, but as Brendan pointed out, it's not. It's a setup to get us to Imperator Furiosa. But in this moment, we think it is. But then we hear when we hear the child, we hear this, we'll go like, well, who is this? Because I think it was a boy who was his child that got killed in the first movie. So who is this? Is this one of the kids from Thunderdome? Is this a kid from some other adventure? Who is this that is saying this stuff to him? Because it's going to keep coming back as he has visions throughout the movie. There's clearly guilt. There's clearly pain. There's stuff he's getting over. Like most tortured heroes, there's guilt carried for the people you didn't save rather than the ones you did. And so already from the beginning, he's a vulnerable protagonist that we have sympathy for from the start, which is just so smart in how you want to present a hero again all these years later.
Well, I think one of the things about this movie, and we're going to hear this throughout, is like this movie's like an iceberg, which is that there is all sorts of details that we the audience are not going to know. But the actors knew, and they had figured it all out. There's so much that is, I will call, if my student came to me and said they wanted to do all this, I would say that's a lot of unnecessary work, and you probably shouldn't do all that. You're wasting your time. And yet it's a lot of that unnecessary work, figuring out who is this kid? What is this backstory? What is going on? Yeah. Even all the details of his clothing, of the car, of everything has a story behind it. It's there. Yeah. We don't always get to know what it is. I mean, in just little details like that we see a two-headed lizard that he's about to eat. I mean, all of that is fantastic. From this slow opening moment, we go suddenly into super fast. And this is another thing about this film. Most of the movie is either slightly overcranked or undercranked. So that means that they're either running the film faster for slow motion or they're running the film slightly slower so things are just a little bit faster. This is something George Miller does all the time. He grabs all his stuff and he drives off super fast, and then it's quiet again. And then these 5 cars jump into frame chasing after him. And we're right into an action sequence.
You know what I love about that shot when he's grabbing all the stuff? And you, like you said, it's cut very quickly. You got a lot of movement. But in his movement, before he even gets in the car, just the grabbing of his bag, the movement, opening of a door, there is engine noise in the sound effects track of all those movements. So, and this, like, circle that because it's going to come up again, but in the reverse. But there is something that they are communicating to you in this right away that it's like human and machine are one in this wasteland. It's all organic. They all have life. They all are important. And so this idea that, you know, as you said, Steve, you hear it right when the Warner Brothers logo shows up. You hear revving. And it's like that is super important to the aesthetic of this film. All engines and machinery and humans are one.
One more crazy thing about this movie, in terms of how they made it, this movie was almost entirely shot in sequence. So this is the first thing that they shot. And everything they shot, that is 100% inefficient. Again, I'm your film school teacher. I would say do not shoot things in sequence. You waste tons of time and money, but that's not what they chose. So, and normally when you're shooting a movie, you generally don't do a big stunt on day one because you want to warm up. You want your crew to kind of get settled. You want everyone to know what to do. But if you're shooting in sequence, well, we're going to go right into a big stunt. So and you think, because you're a fan of Mad Max, that, okay, we got a car chase. Mad Max is the king of car chases. We're going to have some epic long car chase. Oh, no. This is going to be over really, really fast. We're chasing off after Max's car. They throw what they call a thunder stick, which is like a spear with a bomb attached to the front, into the car. It explodes. And right from the beginning, it should be obvious to everybody watching it that unlike a lot of other action movies made in Hollywood, this is the first of many, many, many completely real stunts. This is not CG. We're not faking this. We're driving cars real fast and we're going to crash them. And you can tell. And it's so funny because I go like, you know, the uncanny valley is this thing where we can kind of see the digital things don't look quite real. And we're moving past that. But there's still something that even today CGI cannot do. And that is just the real chaos of real things happening in a stunt like this.
It's almost like a James Bond beginning, isn't it? Like you get the action sequence and then unfortunately he gets caught, which rarely happens at a James Bond beginning. But to start us off with an action sequence right off the bat, rather than grooving us into the movie, like, okay, it's been a few decades. Let's reestablish the world. Let's talk about things. Let's set things up. No, right off the bat, our hero is being chased down. And he's not that, like, he takes off before those cars get there, but they catch up to him really fast and take him out really fast. And now we're like, well, what's going on here? You know, it's almost like that Austin Powers movie where they captured Dr. Evil in the first quarter of the movie. And you're like, wait, what just happened here? That's not how it works. So I like that immediately you're like, well, where do we go now? He got caught. Where are we going next? So I like that it keeps the audience off kilter. I think that's the whole point George is trying to do throughout the movie, is to keep you consistently on the edge of your seat, not knowing what's going on. And as you alluded to, Steve, the slowing down or the speeding up of some of these scenes is all meant to make you feel like I can't sit still. I can't put a pole in the ground to feel some sort of foundational strength here. So I love that.
Talk about being off kilter. I think the entirety of Fury Road is sans kilter. You have no kilter throughout this whole thing. Yeah. The stunt coordinator, by the way, is Guy Norris. And Guy Norris is not only a longtime stunt coordinator, but he is, in his youth, was a stuntman on Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior. In fact, he is the subject of one of the most infamous and famous stunts, which is he's the guy who crashes his motorcycle, goes spinning out of control flying. He broke his leg on that stunt. Fortunately, it got used in the movie. And by the way, because this is how, tough Australian stuntmen act, is after a day in the hospital where they pinned his leg back together, he went back on the set and started doing more stunts. So
I remember the first time I saw The Road Warrior, that stunt, I was like, wow, that's amazing that they got that mannequin to look so lifelike as it spun through the air like that. And only afterwards I found out, nope, that was a human being.
Yeah.
So Guy Norris, now, 25 years later or whatever, is the stunt coordinator. It's him driving Max's car. He wanted to outdo. They actually set a world record for flips when they were practicing. Mm-hmm. They didn't flip it quite so many times, but it is a crazy amount of flips on this stunt. It is a crazy, crazy stunt.
Yeah.
And we see Max kind of crawling, shaky focus out of the car, liquids dripping everywhere.
I am the one who runs from both the living and the dead, hunted by scavengers, haunted by those I could not protect.
And within this shaky, sort of surreal footage, now, in addition to hearing this voice, we see this girl. And there's something happen. It's really fast where it's like she's getting run down by her car. We see her face. This actually character is named Glory. And if you were to read the prequel comics, you would find out a little bit about this story. But I have not read the prequel comics.
Interesting. Okay.
But that is what this is, what's going on here.
Yeah, I was wondering what it was referencing. Because his wife and his son will run over like that.
Yeah.
I mean, what's so interesting to me about it is the feeling is like, it's almost a feeling like it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Because it's like, well, Max has gone beyond, has experienced so much pain and tragedy that he's just gone beyond the level of sanity at this point.
And the way I read it was like the way you'd read like the New Testament Gospels. Like it's like, oh yeah, this was the same story from Mark as there is in Matthew, but it's slightly different. And there's 3 people here rather than 2 or whatever. Like that's just like this shifting focus, because none of these movies are actually like, canonically connected. They're just 4 separate stories.
But it's also intriguing for the viewer, right? There's a mystery here now, right? Like what's this mean? What's this going on? So, all right, not only do we have him starting off really fast, not only do we have him being captured so quickly, now we've got a mystery. What is this? Who are these people? What happened here? And of course, it makes you, if you're any remotely logical person, you go, oh, of course, he's been on other adventures. It's not like these are the only adventures Mad Max has been on or the only situations that Mad Max has had to confront and save people from. These are just remnants of stuff that have been happening for the last 3 decades since we saw him in Thunderdome. So again, it just kind of puts you that this world is filled out. Max has this incredible inner life, and there's a lot going on for this guy as we catch him right now in this particular adventure.
Well, and to be clear, again, it feels like this is all the things Steve teaches at film school that are apparently wrong. It's like if Steve Morris was writing this screenplay and we introduced the mystery of some trauma, at some point we'd have him sit in a vulnerable moment with Furiosa and explain the backstory, and it would be emotional and cathartic, and that would allow him to move on, because that is the way good screenwriting works.
Yeah.
That's not what happens here.
So I exist in this wasteland. A man reduced to a single instinct. Survive.
And on the word survive, the music hits and we see Max run into frame chained to the back of a car. It's a great, great shot. Fade to black, we come back, his hair is being cut, and there's these kids who are all in white that we don't quite understand what they are. They're gathering his hair. He's being tattooed. One of the words we see on the tattoo is universal donor. Yeah. And they are going to brand him with this skull brand, and he fights and he escapes, and this sequence is fucking crazy. He's still bound and gagged. We don't know where we are. He's running through some tunnel. He sees a car. He jumps over it, and you have all of these guys coming after him. There are all these guys whose skin is painted white. They have bald heads, and these are the War Boys.
War Boys!
We see there's like light shining through and a green space above him, and he climbs up on these monkey bars and he's holding on to them. And then we see that same girl from the vision looking down at him and says,
Max, is that you?
So he's literally having hallucinations right in the middle of being chased and attacked. Like, that's how crazed Max has gone.
You could also argue like the amount of accidents he's probably had in that car, the amount of falls he's taken in this wasteland of rocks and Grant. Like, this is like concussion type stuff. This is CTE type stuff where he is completely messed up seeing these visuals. I mean, when he's running through the images of people, right? The visions of people who different age, the skin come off, it's just skull for a second. So there's all these visions he's having as he's running away with all these people telling him to stop or to go back or not. So what is this all about? And I love the way this is shot, as you said, Steve, because we feel the claustrophobia, not only of the area, but maybe of his mind. Maybe it's even symbolic of the claustrophobia in his mind, trying to run from all these different sections and different things. And he's smart, he's strong, he can get out of 8 people in the water. He does all kinds of things here to keep going. So that we're about to get to that I think is fantastic. And he almost gets away. Depending on where that hook was going to take him.
It's super chaotic. As you said, these visions are coming towards him. Yeah. He's running towards this door. He bursts through the door, and this is this thing that George Miller does so well, is it was dark, super fast-paced, and super loud and chaotic. And when he bursts through the door, it's suddenly bright gold and silent. And we suddenly realize he's on a cliff, and he almost falls. He looks down at these people. We see skull across the way on another mesa. We see the green plants around. We get a good idea of this environment. And then, John, as you said, he sees this hook, and he runs back to get his start, and he leaps out, catches the hook, catches the chain. There's these bald guys on the ledge behind him trying to pull him back in. It is super intense, super scary. They hook onto the hook, and they drag him back in. His face now covered with this gold fabric for whatever reason, and the doors slam shut, and there is the title, Mad Max Fury Road. Gentlemen.
So he's captured twice in the same sequence, which I think is really fantastic or fascinating to think about. But as a guy who's afraid of heights, when he hooks up onto that hook, I'm losing my goddamn mind. And then when they suck him back in, it's even more horrifying, with all these hands reaching out to grab you back into this cave and then put your face through whatever that orange plastic thing is. And you see the horror as he's screaming, getting yanked into this situation. So yeah, all of this is just such a great beginning before the title card appears.
Well, like you said, John, the idea that it's similar to a James Bond cold open, and kind of film logic dictates that when you see a sequence like this, it's about establishing the hero and watching him, succeed against an opening gambit like this. And I do remember sitting there in the theater in this moment when it happened, and he swings out on that hook, and then they get him. Like, it kind of short circuits your brain a little bit. You're like, oh wait, he's captured? Like, I thought the whole point was he was captured and he got away. Now he's captured again. It is a wonderful little unplugging of your film logic in that moment.
Well, you said, Brendan, when we started, that there was a moment that you realized you were just in the world when you were first seeing the movie. This moment, I can remember being in the theater, and when he gets dragged in and those doors closed, I was just like, I've never been in this space. Like, it's completely a new thing.
Okay, well, I will tell you, the moment that happened for me was within the next 12 minutes. And I want to mark this. I this time when I was rewatching it, I pressed the remote to see what the time code was, and I saw that we were at the 6-minute mark of the movie. And from minute 6 to minute 18, I think this is George Miller's masterpiece, that he creates the world here for you. He's done this in all of the films, first of all, I should say. Like, his shorthand world building has always been one of the franchise's greatest assets. And the weird comparison I make to him with this is that he treats the world the same way David Chase treated The Sopranos. And it's like he never over-explains. He thinks you're smart enough to understand what's going on. If you don't exactly get it, he wants you to just go with it and enjoy the fireworks. Sometimes no explanations needed, and that's okay. Like, you're in his hands. And all of the other movies do that very carefully and very deliberately. But I just think this 12 minutes here did it in a way so overwhelming to my senses that the reveal of this Citadel world, one layer after another, and your introduction to Furiosa, we'll talk about all of this, of course, but just the introduction to the brides, to Miss Giddy, to all of the details of his sons. It's a miraculous 12 minutes that we could easily spend an hour just talking about this section of the film. You could make a film out of this part of the film, right? And for him to do it so concisely, and I remember it was the moment where the son that's in the chair, right, who's being the lookout. And he says, Rictus, go check on Dad. See what's bothering Dad. And all of a sudden, you just, boom, had this family dynamic just crystallize for you as this, evil, skull-faced, brute runs off for some reason that you're unaware of at the moment. And then you see him running through this lush greenery that's being watered. And that was the moment where I remember kind of stepping out of myself and being like, holy crap, like we're in a new place. This is the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, 100%. So we've met Tom Hardy as Max. We're about to meet Charlize Theron as Furiosa. Yeah. And so I just want to talk very briefly about the casting, is that Charlize Theron is the only person on this movie who didn't have to audition. Is that for some reason, everyone else, and we're going to talk about some of the audition processes, because I think, John, they will both, on the one hand, sound like the greatest thing you've ever heard, and on the other hand, maybe piss you off. Well, it could be both at the same time.
We'll see.
But all that happened was Charlize Theron had a meeting with George Miller. They had lunch, and at the end of it, he just said, "You're going to be Furiosa." Wow. And they were really not sure about Tom Hardy. He was kind of resistant to Tom Hardy, and it wasn't until he saw the two of them together and they had a meeting that he went, oh, that's it. Tom Hardy's cast. That's how he got cast, because he fit well with her.
Well, people forget that Tom Hardy had been building since 2000 his career, and they had shots at multiple franchises. He was in Star Trek Nemesis, which people forget. He'd been
there's good reasons to forget Star Trek Nemesis, frankly.
Fair point. But he'd been slowly building his career, he popped up in Layer Cake. So these little things like this that he was working through and trying to make a name and trying to get himself. And it's around the 2010 that you start to see a little more when he breaks out with Inception. Then you see him in Warrior, which I think is a fantastically underappreciated film. Then he's Bane in Dark Knight Rises. So now he's elevating, right? And I love The Drop, which is a small film in 2014. But then here comes Mad Max Fury Road. Here comes Legend, where he plays the two twin gangsters there. Here comes The Revenant. So that's the year when everything changed for him, is 2015. And so people think, oh, you would just give Tom Hardy the role. No, the fact that he had to audition and see if he had chemistry with Charlize, who was a much more established actress by this point, makes all the sense in the world. If you're going to have him replace essentially Mel Gibson, you've got to find the right guy. And it seems like a no-brainer to cast him, but at the time, you got to make sure he's got the right tools and the right chemistry. So that does make sense to me. And Charlize being, by the way, I just watched Young Adult last night. This is an incredible actress that we just do not talk about enough with Charlize, and what she does here, it's stellar.
And speaking of her, we get our first glimpse of Furiosa walking away from camera towards the war rig. We see that she has the brand on the back of her neck that Max had avoided. And we also see, and I think this is one of the most brilliant things in the film, is that we see that she is missing an arm and has this mechanical arm, and is never mentioned. There's literally, they don't throw anything on it at all.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is an incredible piece of character design. And this was a real process to make an arm that would work, that was practical for the most part. The last thing they wanted to do, they knew they were going to CG her real arm out. But the last thing they wanted to do was add just a computer-generated appendage to her.
Right.
And it was funny. They tried several of them out because she would have to come and try them on and see how they work. And it had not gone well with the first 3 or 4 versions. Finally, they're sort of going, if we don't get it on this version, we're going to have to go CG. And she tries it on, and she says, this is totally badass. That was her response when they finally got the right arm.
And to find out how this happens, you can watch Furiosa, which is currently on Max right now.
There you go. And then the camera tilts up, and just the world that he creates and how it operates. Like, we see this tanker being lowered down, and we see these huge wheels that are basically external hamster wheels where humans are walking on them in order to lift up or lower down these huge platforms. It's crazy.
Yeah, all those details are the kind of things where when you're watching it for the first time in the theater, or at least this is how I felt, I'm like, I want to pause this so that I can take that thing in that I just saw. But on the other hand, I don't. I want to keep getting plowed over by this imagery, by these ideas. It's you just don't get this enough. It's nourishment. It feels so fulfilling as they're doling it out to you, especially as special as this is, as you go from one idea to the next. I mean, once you get down to the war boys who are, congregating around downstairs, and they finally kind of dump information at you, it feels totally organic at that point. You're like, oh, I get it. I get what you're saying. Blood bags, totally. Yeah, I'm in.
Well, this is what I mean by the 10,000 ideas. It's like there's so literally every shot.
And look, what they're establishing here, again, and I think you said it really well, Brendan. There's a confidence in the way George Miller is establishing this world. He is not stopping so that you can catch up and hold your hand and show you what's going on so you get it. He's going, there's a million things going on. Whatever you grab, but you get the general gist of this thing, that this is essentially a commune. There is a cult leader who we're about to meet, and there are separate subsections of people who are involved in this cult that all lead as a hierarchy in a pyramid back to Immortan Joe at the top here, who we're about to see getting dressed, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Well, one last thing before we leave Furiosa is, of course, her hair, which is that there was all sorts of plans. There was dreadlocks, there was huge blonde wigs, there was all sorts of, mohawks and all the things. And finally, it's Charlize's idea. She calls up George apparently in the middle of the night, like at 3 a.m, and says, what if I just shave my head? And he goes, absolutely. And anytime you have an idea and want to call me. Like that's how this happened. It's just her idea. And she is a huge contributor to this film.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Well, you hinted at it, John. We're about to meet the Immortan Joe. And the first thing we see is his hideous carbuncle-filled skin being with some kid blowing dust onto it. And it is nasty.
And this, of course, is powder of some sort, I imagine.
Well, you chafe out in the desert. You got to take care of your skin. And this, of course, is Hugh Keays-Byrne.
Yeah, Hugh Keays-Byrne's plays Immortan Joe. For those of you who don't know, he is also Toe Cutter in the first movie. He's the villain in the first movie. And I think, as Brendan said, since these are folk tales and how George Miller doesn't necessarily deal with canon with this Mad Max series, because, talk about Bruce Spence and the weird ways he shows up throughout the series. The same thing here. You can use the same actor who was the villain in the first film to be the villain in this film. And he was so gracious to come back and be a part of this thing. He didn't really break out in America too much, so stayed pretty much in Australia, but he became noticed in roles in Stone, Mad Dog Women, The Trespassers, and Death Train in 1978. And then boom, Mad Max is what really kind of blew him up. And you could see him in Farscape, you could see him in Moby Dick, and sadly passed away in 2020, 5 years after the film was made. But there was so much love for him when he came back and going to conventions and whatever. People were able to tell him how much they really appreciated him. And if you haven't watched him on interviews on YouTube, he is a wonderfully interesting human being. And his answers and his responses, he is so just matter of fact and down to earth. Highly recommend you guys going into a wormhole to listen to his interviews or watch his interviews.
I think he was going to be Martian Manhunter too, right? In the Justice League.
Yes.
Yeah,
that was the point there.
He would have been a great Martian Manhunter.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
he apparently was like the glue, you know, like he came into this as understood not just what his role in the character was, but how to create that role with the actors who are the war boys, with the stuntmen, is that he had photos of himself put up all over the town, everywhere. He would make sure that anytime he walked into a space that they announced that the Immortan Joe was about to come in before he walked into any space. And it sounds like the war boys and the stuntmen at first kind of resisted this, but then they started to chant and to gather and to worship him everywhere he went. It was just, here's the Immortan Joe, and that's a huge, it's just one of those other collaborative pieces of what builds this movie, is who he is as an actor, you know. Yeah. So they're assembling this what's going to be the war rig, which is like a big huge tanker, and what George Miller said is like, these are essentially the two antagonists, is the war rig and the Immortan Joe. You know, that's what we're building here. And we see the war boys, who are really a combination of their actors, their stuntmen, and their locals, you know, that are there to fill out this group in Namibia. And we see Joe's armor being assembled. And it's basically, I mean, the design of this guy is astounding. Yeah. It is so, and this is one of the things that's amazing about George Miller, is that he's crazy. Is that he likes craziness. You know what I mean? Like, and I should say is, honestly, he seems like the most down-to-earth, calm, mellow, lovely, warm guy you could possibly imagine. But his visual style, his ideas are freaking nuts. And the Immortan Joe's, everything about his outfit is amazing to me.
Yeah, it's almost like the way when you were a kid, if you take apart a He-Man or a G.I. Joe,
yeah,
the chest and the back, that you could clasp them back together and put the screw back in. That's almost like what's over this guy's, you know, putrid flesh. He has assembled the action figure pieces around him.
Yeah, and isn't it the greatest thing in comics when you see the ugliest of villains from the inside out? They decay in their body. So the fact that he decided to do that, to make it an element of the character here, that his flesh is decaying, it's chafed, it's all these things that are happening. It makes you feel like uncomfortable, unsettled. But then he's got this lion's mane type of hair and the voice and then the oxygen mask. So there's overall, the presentation is something that unsettles you and scares you and overwhelms you at the same time. So getting that right, I'm sure, took a lot of conversation, but also a lot of instincts from Hugh Keays-Byrne about how to make this work in the world that Miller was creating here for this installment.
There's so many details that are cool, like the fact that the plexiglass chest has medals all over it, just like a tin plate dictator would have. You know, the fact that the mask, which is just astounding just to look at that mask, but then, it's actually like an air filter and a breather, and they've built bellows onto his back to filter out his air. And so this, what happens is you introduce this person who is super sickly, like this is a weak person who's fallen apart. And then you put this thing on him that makes him look super intimidating. And both of those, the diseased element of his character and the power of the guy, walk around simultaneously, largely created by this design, you know?
Yeah.
It's like if you got the Darth Vader helmet placement scene in the very first 5 minutes of Star Wars, as opposed to halfway through Empire.
That's a great example, because he really, it's like Darth Vader. You're right. He is his mask. You know what I mean? He is this outfit. That is the Immortan Joe.
Rev it up for the Immortan Joe! Once again, we send off my war rig to bring back gasoline from Castown and bullets from the bullet farm.
Gasoline.
Once again, I salute my Imperator Furiosa, and I salute my half-life war boys, who will ride with me eternal on the highways of Valhalla.
And the war boys all hold their hands up in this gesture, which I think they called the V8 gesture. And this was something that was created by one of the war boys. Oh, wow. And it happened in one of these demonstrations they had when Immortan Joe came in, when the actor came in and announced his presence. They started building these chants, all these gestures, and all of this stuff, and their way of relating to the Immortan Joe. It really came organically from the stuntmen and the actors who are playing the war boys.
It's a great way to get actors to have ownership in your movie of what they're creating, right? You do these things, you improv it, you don't know where it's going to lead, and I'm sure Hugh Keays-Byrne did this to make a shortcut of, let's just get these people already programmed to worship me when I walk through the door. So when we shoot these scenes, it's automatic for them. Oh, someone came up with this gesture that works perfectly. Let's add that to the movie. So it's just really smart filmmaking on so many levels.
What's crazy about it to me is this is exactly the kind of rehearsal, actor experimentation that you would have in a character drama. You know, like there's so many movies where you go like, I need these people to build a relationship. So I'm going to have my actors, I'm going to have them go through an experience together. We're going to hang out together. We're going to cook a meal together. We're going to do all those things to sort of build, like Coppola inviting all of the cast of Godfather up to his place in Marin, where they made the full Italian meal served by Talia Shire to sort of build all these relationships. Nobody talks about doing that in a crazy action movie. Nobody does that. That's the amazing thing. Like the heart of this movie is it's actually this experimental artsy film because we don't have a script. We're all out of storyboards. We're shooting in order. We're on the location and we're having all these actors here go through all this stuff. We're going to get to more of it. There's all sorts of crazy stuff they did with the actors. That's part of the secret sauce of this movie.
And I don't mean to step on a landmine here, but I mean, George Miller could essentially be kind of Immortan Joe. I'm going to take you all out into the middle of nowhere. There's no script. You're going to depend on me. I've got my female warrior in Charlize Theron, who didn't even have to audition for this. She is my role. We are working together to make this movie. You all are in service of the film. So, and I don't mean to call him a dictator, but in some weird way, it's a cousin to what you see in the movie. Not that George Miller is decaying or anything like that, but you see elements of it here because you've got to give your trust to the director on a set like this, especially, as you said, Steve, when you're out in the middle of nowhere.
And he had some that wanted to rebel as well.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure. Yeah.
And I should say, too, just the image of the rust-colored machinery in the gold light with these white bodies of the war boys, it's just totally stunning, and there's no movie that remotely looks like this in any way.
I am your redeemer. It is by my hand you will rise from the ashes of this world.
And they all cheer and they run forward because they know what's coming. All the people with their cups and their bowls. And Joe has these big levers in front of him and he pulls them back, dousing his crowd with water in what I can only say seems like the most inefficient and wasteful water distribution system ever devised.
Yeah, and he's a real dick about it too, because then he tells them, don't get addicted to this stuff. It's bad for you.
Right.
It's terrible.
He's working on them both physically and mentally by turning them in. As you said, Steve, the distribution of water is so ineffective, which makes it all the more precious because you don't know how much you can get from it. And then telling you not to be addicted to the thing that he's giving you is messing with your mind, And so where have I seen that recently? But anyway, I'm watching the movie this time around. There was a lot of things that felt topical.
There's a lot of stuff
unsettled me as I was watching the fucking movie. And I found that to be a way, something that you think is a fantasy is now all of a sudden in your mind feeling like it might be a possibility. So it was something.
I'm just continuing to be blown away by your comment, Brendan, about these as myths or folktales, because that totally makes my statement about how wasteful this water distribution system is. It makes it makes that completely go away because this is a myth. This is a story you tell your kid. We don't care that everything has to fit together or make sense because this is a myth,
And in the telling of a story, that's how it would seem. Oh, just gushing water came out of everywhere, right?
It's just like someone giving you a taste of the drug for free, going like, all right, you can have a taste. If you want to come back, feel free to come back. You know you're going to be.
And we cut to driving in this beautiful gold light. And now we get a really great look at Furiosa. And one of the other design elements I absolutely love is the dark grease makeup on her upper part of her face. And in particular, I really think there's just a tinge of blue within the dark makeup that matches perfectly with her eyes and sets off this contrast with the gold skin and the warm light. Like, it is a stunning visual in a close-up of Furiosa.
Yeah.
And then we go from there to the camera craning down to Max, who is now in a birdcage.
I got a war boy running on empty. Hook up that full life.
And they open up the bottom of the cage because Max is a universal donor. And you start to figure out, if you saw those words before, what we're talking about, which is that he is going to be a blood bag.
It's also so amazing how none of those words are things we use for the actual thing they're talking about, like someone who's dying of cancer essentially, and they call them half-lives, and this guy who's in the cage, he's a full life, and yet within that moment there's no confusion. You know exactly what they're talking about. You have kind of adjusted yourself to their vernacular, and it totally makes sense. And I do want to note that this goes back to George Miller's history as a doctor, that he had experienced, giving transfusions to people, particularly cancer patients, to kind of juice them up. He said he remembered it specifically with his own father, that his father was dying of cancer, and when he would get a blood transfusion, it would be like a good day for him. He'd be revved up again. And that's just a kind of wild personal element to bring into this world and make it feel real, make it feel impactful, and you understand right away what they're doing and why Max is now serving the purpose that he serves.
Back with Furiosa, who is part of this caravan, and we have a lead car with a war boy in front of the war rig. We have other cars following her. She looks along the road towards Gastown, and then she shifts gears and shifts off-road. And then the guy who is essentially security on the war rig runs up and says,
"Boss, we're not going to Gastown?
We're heading east.
I'll pass it down the line."
And then he goes out and gives the orders along the line for what has to happen now that they're changing course, because he is a totally loyal lieutenant to Furiosa. And frankly, I feel bad for this guy.
Yeah, I love that one guy who drives by and is like, "What are we doing?" And he's like, "No, we're going this way."
And then we cut to a rather large breast on a pump, because there are a bunch of women who are contributing some sustenance and being, essentially milked. And we get a big glass of milk, which we hand off to Rictus Erectus, one of Immortan Joe's son, who's played by Nathan Jones.
Nathan Jones, who is 6'11", by the way. This guy comes from a line of incredible athletes and fighters within his own family. He dominated strongman contests in the 1990s, including a notable victory in the Highland Games World Strongman Challenge at only 26 years old. From there, he went on to be in the WWE as a pro wrestler. It was in WrestleMania with The Undertaker and what have you there. So certainly established himself that way. But how he got into acting was through Jackie Chan, Steve. Jackie Chan, they worked together on something, and he encouraged him to go forward with that. And that's where Nathan now kind of transitioned into becoming an actor. It's not Batista, it's not John Cena, it's not The Rock, but he's carved out his own niche in the way that he can here in films like Troy, Ricky Stenicki, Mortal Kombat, Hobbs and Shaw, and the most recent Furiosa as well. It popped up as reprising his character. So you see all of that with Nathan, and he is a striking character as an actor for sure.
One thing that I would never have noticed, but this is why this is a movie that you could just keep on studying and studying, but the images that are all over Rictus Erectus are baby images. So his codpiece on his knees, everywhere there's baby faces, that he is obsessed with babies, just as you are. And he tastes the milk for his dad. And there we also see Joe's other son, who is the diminutive figure of Corpus Colossus, who is played by Quentin Kenahan.
Yeah, this is Quentin Kenahan's an interesting actor. Sadly passed away in 2018 at the age of 43. But of course, what you see him dealing with there is a rare bone disease called osteogenesis imperfecta. And I think he stands out so strongly in the movie and what he does. He was only in 4 films: Dr. Plunk, You and Your Stupid Mate, Thunderstruck, and of course, Mad Max Fury Road. And at the time of his death, he had been nominated to stand as a counselor for the City of Adelaide elections in November 9th of 2018. So a guy who clearly established himself and came to the attention of because of what he was dealing with when he was profiled in a documentary at 7 years old by Australian journalist Mike Willizzi. So just an interesting gentleman here who, of course, sadly passed away at a young age, but stands out so distinctly in the movie and fits perfectly in the film.
And he is one who notices that Joe's produce isn't going to Gastown.
Yeah, of course.
And he and his brother are trying to figure out what the hell's going on when Dad runs off, runs through the hydroponic garden to this giant sort of safe door, which he opens. He goes through this round entrance, calling out for Splendid. And we go into this space, and we're in a high angle. We see these words painted on the floor that say, "Our babies will not be warlords."
Where are they?
They are not your property.
Miss Giddy!
You cannot own a human being.
And that is Miss Giddy, played by Jennifer Hagen.
Yeah, this is such a strong character to come into the film, right? Because, I mean, she's pulling a shotgun on him from the beginning and showing that she won't be pushed around by him. And this is an actress who's worked for a number of years here, born in 1943. She was in a number of films like Jack and Paper Giants, The Birth of Cleo, and of course a part of Mad Max Fury Road, but a striking figure that doesn't really do much to stop him in that way. But still, the design and the look of her and the way she's fighting back, you can tell that she's someone that is, I think, foreshadowing what we're going to see later from Charlize Theron's people when she gets to reunite with them later on in the movie. Tough women in all of these Mad Max films.
I mean, that's one of the themes, and I think it really is exemplified here, because we also see the sign that says you cannot own a human being, and we're starting to get to what this is about, like what this is really about, and she's aiming a weapon at him, and I just go, man, if you had just shot him. Like, you had plenty of time to shoot him.
Sooner or later, someone pushes back.
Where is she taking them?
She didn't take them. They begged her to go.
And unfortunately, she doesn't get that shot off. He grabs the gun as she fires into the ceiling. And by the way, so Miss Giddy, covered in tattoos, words written all around her. This was an 8-hour application process to put this all on. And so what she finally decided was like, it didn't make sense for her to take it off at night. Like normally with your makeup, you would take it all off and then put it on again. But that just took too much time. So she just left it on. And then they just had to repair whatever she had, rubbed off on the sheets or anything she did. So she was in this makeup a lot of the time.
Oof. Yeah.
Where is she taking them?
A long way from you.
What George Miller said is that really the plot is just something we see throughout history, which is a monarch desperately looking for a healthy male heir to carry on the monarchy. This is Henry VIII. This is a million different times in history. That's what the Immortan Joe is doing.
And goes back to that Brendan McCarthy treatment of this is a story about trying to deliver pure sperm to a warlord, which I also think is interesting that you're going to follow this through the film right up to the very end, that in all the other Mad Max movies, there is a precious resource. It's usually gasoline. They talk about gasoline here, and sometimes it's water, and they talk about water here. But unlike in Road Warrior, where they are trying to transport the gasoline, right? Or unlike in Thunderdome, where it's all about the control of this methane plant, right? Here, it's about humans. The resource is humanity. And that's the through line from all the way back in that first treatment, and it becomes the central premise of this film, and it really is like the salvation of the film, and ultimately I think it's the connection between Furiosa and Max is them exchanging themselves as humans to what we see physically at the end of the film.
Yeah.
And for me at least, I don't think, it's not that there was nothing moving to me in any of the other Mad Max films. There are things that moved me, but there's no comparison with this. There's some weird alchemy that occurs, and this is a piece of it that by the end, I'm near tears like multiple times.
Totally.
And it's not done in the traditional way of a character and their story and all that. It's not. But everything is here.
Yeah.
We have a great cut to the blood bags hanging upside down. And by the way, at one point when it was going to be Mel Gibson, this was how they were going to reintroduce Mel Gibson. Is the first sight you would have of him is hanging up and upside down as a blood bag, which I think
you
is
would
awesome.
see his ass. That was what they wanted. They wanted like the camera to be on his ass, and then they'd be like, "Yeah, get that blood bag," and they'd turn around and you'd see Mel Gibson's face.
I mean, Mel has shown his ass many times,
Yeah.
and I think he's always been successful. So there you go. And this is where we meet Nux, played by Nicholas Hoult.
Oh, man, I mean, what do you want me to say about Nicholas Hoult? What a fantastic actor who's really blown up over the last few years. Certainly 2024 has been an incredibly positive year for him with his work in Nosferatu and Juror Number 2, which a lot of people are discovering now on Max, and thought that maybe it might line up with some Oscar nominations. It did not, but a good Clint Eastwood movie. And another film that kind of went under the radar that I think he's incredible in, The Order, which is dealing with white supremacy with Jude Law, is fantastic as well. But certainly over the last few years with Renfield, with The Great, with Crossing Swords, he's really established himself, and of course in the X-Men franchise, as Hank McCoy / Beast. So a great actor, of course, first seen in About a Boy when we saw him as a child with Hugh Grant in that movie and Toni Collette. But clearly has established himself. And at this point in his career, he's kind of in that, like, take me seriously, I'm not a kid actor anymore type of stage. And so this is one of those performances that really announces him as an actor again at this stage of his career.
Well, Nicholas Hoult is one of those guys who he falls into a category that personally I love, although it might be frustrating for guys like him to be in this category, which is that they're beautiful people, very attractive, should clearly be leading men, but their soul is that of a weirdo. Like they love doing weird shit, and like they cannot hide it. And so I do think that has probably put a little bit of a lid on his career as a leading man, as a heartthrob, which he clearly could be just visually. But like if you watch his performance in The Great, you're like, this dude loves being weird. Like he is chewing this up. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, it's enjoyable. And he is like relishing the opportunity to let his freak flag fly, right? And I just think there's a lot of space for guys like him, and I'm always appreciative when I see performances like this. Like I said, their agents might not agree with me, but I love him in this movie. I love his performances almost every time I see him.
Yeah. Don't forget The Favorite, where he's so good as that jerk off throughout the whole movie. Yeah, so good.
So let's talk about this crazy casting process. This is how this went about. So the casting directors are Nikki Barrett and Ronna Kress. And normally when you're casting a movie, you have this little thing that you use that's called a script. And what you would do was when you want actors to play a part in the script, you would send them their parts, which are called sides, and they would prepare them, and they would come in and they would read the parts that they were prepared so you could see that they can act in your movie. There's no script. So here's what they did. Instead, and this is George Miller's idea. He's like, you know what? Auditioning for movies is terrible and it's difficult, and I want to be able to give something back. Let's give something back to the actors so that they can have a really good experience. So instead of booking them for the 5 minutes to read a piece of the script, he had them come in for several 2-4 hour blocks, like long periods of time.
Yeah.
And he said the first piece of these workshops where they had to come in and tell a true story about themselves, a vulnerable story. He wrote them a letter before they came in. And the end of the letter said, "This is not about an end result. This is about process," which I just love that so much.
Yeah.
And these actors had to come in and tell the saddest thing that ever happened to them. And the goal was to learn who was willing to be honest, who was willing to go deep. And part of this is that you're going to live with these people for 7 months in the desert. You know what I mean? Like this is a kind of a commitment that's way beyond what a normal movie is. Yeah. But it's also, in general, when you're casting a small part in your crazy action movie, you're not looking for tremendous emotional honesty. Like that's not a necessary part of someone who's playing a small part in an action movie. But he felt that was 100% necessary. Then they did a whole bunch of Meisner exercises where they had to repeat words that the other person says. John, I know you've probably done these things.
Give me PTSD from this stuff. Yeah.
That's what I said. I said, I feel like you'll have both reactions to this. And they also gave them a scene to prepare. And they gave them scenes from Network, from Monty Python's The Holy Grail, from When Harry Met Sally, from Aaron Brockovich, and from other movies. And they said, basically, we don't care which of these scenes you want to prepare. Whatever you want to do is fine. And the big thing he said is, don't worry about mimicry. We don't want you to do what was in the movie. We want you to do your own thing. And then so they all come in having prepared these parts. And then George walks around and pairs them up with each other. And then sometimes he'll swap the parts. Sometimes he'll have men playing women. Sometimes he'll play old people playing young people. It doesn't matter to him. He kept moving it around. Nicholas Hoult said this was one of the great experiences he ever had. He said, even if he hadn't gotten cast in the movie, it would have been totally worth it because he'd never had a director just want to play with him in this way. And it's funny, George resisted casting Nicholas Hoult. He was like, no, I don't think this is the right guy. And he hadn't really met with him yet. The casting directors had. And they basically said, you have to see him again. We have to bring him in again. He brought him in. Once he saw him and spent time with him, said, you are absolutely right, and cast him on the spot.
But that first instinct, it's like, again, too pretty to be weird, too weird to be pretty. Like I guarantee this guy has had more adversity in his career than you'd think because he looks like a charmed actor. But I'm sure it's run up against him a bunch of times.
Well, it's ironic in a film being led by Charlize Theron, right? And because that was something she had to fight through until she did Monster. It wasn't until she did Monster that people started looking at her differently as an actress, offering her different roles, North Country, and even, as I said, young adult. These are the things that you see Charlize now be able to flex her strength as an actress.
Oh, Tully. She's so good in Tully.
Oh, Tully, right. Yeah, Tully was another one of the most recent ones with her and Mackenzie Davis. Good stuff there. So, yeah, she's... it's ironic that it would happen on a film like that, but you kind of have to prove yourself in certain ways when you're pretty as well in the world of acting.
I always have.
Yes.
So we have cars being lowered down, and now we have all the war boys coming through where Nux is getting his blood transfusion, including Slit, played by Josh Hellman.
Yeah, Josh Hellman, an interesting Australian actor. He's in this film, obviously, but he's also in X-Men Days of Future Past and Jack Reacher, really kind of establishing himself step by step. He voices stuff on Harley Quinn. He was in a TV show called Deputy, a really interesting film called Small Engine Repair that not a lot of people got a chance to see here. And he's done some interesting work throughout the years in franchises and outside of franchises, which I've kind of personally appreciated about him. And of course, as I mentioned, Days of Future Past, he plays the younger version of Bill Stryker, which is the character that
Brian Cox.
Brian Cox played in X-Men 2. So established himself, really strong Australian actor. And I didn't even recognize him until I started doing research for the film that he was the same actor as Stryker in X-Men Days of Future Past. So yeah.
And he's an entirely different villain in Furiosa. Again, another actor who crosses over playing a different role.
Yeah, Scrotus. Plays Scrotus.
All right, wait, hang on. We got to talk about that. Scrotus, Rictus, Slit. Then that's just the bad guys. You've got Toast the Knowing, Cheeto. He has this amazing gift, Miller does, and you think back to the other movies as well, Lord Humongous and Auntie Entity. It's almost like a Thomas Pynchon level ability to give someone a ridiculous name that's still awesome. And we have to give credit to that. But also, if we're talking about Slit right here, I did want to make mention, now that we've kind of been introduced to the three main villains, you got your villain and your two henchmen, essentially.
Yeah.
These movies are all so good at creating very distinctive villains. There is never a it's literally the same actor. Toe Cutter and Immortan Joe are the same, and they are entirely different as villains. They are also entirely different from the Lord Humongous and Humongous's crew, and the little toady that's around Lord Humongous, and the people that are around Immortan Joe. Totally different. It's just one of those things where you'd think there would come a point where it would stop being interesting, or you'd start to get redundant with these villains. They're always different, and they're always entertaining. They're also always bad. You're never like, oh, that cool villain, I can't wait for him to, get one over on somebody. No, you want them. It's very satisfying when they get what's coming to them.
There's also no backstory for any of them.
No, and that's even better, yeah.
It's totally unnecessary. As soon as you see them, you're like, oh yeah, I got it. I understand what's going on here.
Well, this is why casting is so essential.
Yeah.
When you're doing a film like this, you're not going to get a background. You've got to find an interesting actor who delivers lines in a certain way that makes you not care that there's no backstory. You're going to make it up in your head depending on the interactions that happen. And as I said earlier, Bruce Spence is another one who's not a villain, but on the hero side, he's two different people, right? Because in Road Warrior, he's the gyro captain, but in Thunderdome, he's called Jedediah. So, and you're like, wait, that's the same actor.
He's flying a plane.
Yeah, it's completely different. So, yeah.
Well, John, you mentioned that when you were younger and you loved Road Warrior and you'd be like quoting lines from it. Like that was how I absorbed it before I ever saw it, was from people talking about it and saying stuff like, just walk away. And I'd be like, what is this thing? Like, why do people that I think are fun seem to like this so much? And like, then you watch it and you're like, oh my God, that guy's the greatest guy ever, this Lord Humongous. And so like, it's almost better that there's no other information, that you just backfill it with everything. Like I backfilled it before I even saw the movie, of people telling me like, yes, this giant guy in a hockey mask and he gives this Shakespearean level speech. Like that is much better than if I had some origin story about the Lord Humongous.
Yeah, agreed.
One of the things, I don't want to go on a terribly long digression in this already digression-filled conversation, but one of the interesting discoveries for me in doing the show with John all these years has been like, oh, yeah, we're talking about these movies, but we're also talking about the friendships and relationships and connections we have with other humans through these movies.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
You know, like that's a big part. It's that there's this whole feeling, and Mad Max is a perfect example of like, you can meet someone who loves Mad Max who you've never met before, and you could talk for a half hour about it right away. It's this human connection, and particularly in us quoting lines. Like quoting lines is a big part of it.
And the gift that George Miller has in all of these movies are the random moments of humor amidst all the madness and craziness, right? If you think of Road Warrior, just that scene where the mechanic is telling him what he needs to do to fix the car, Max's car, and you've got the other guys, go through the generator. These little things like that, you're like, oh my God, this is genius and so funny, yet it totally doesn't take me out of the world, because of course the world would be so colossally fucked up that people like this would exist in situations, and there's a human comedy in all of that feels organic and real, while not taking away from the real stakes of life and death that are constantly around the corner in the world he's built in all of these movies.
You have to imagine that a guy on highway duty as an emergency doctor develops a pretty strong gallows humor, right? You know, and that definitely shines through in a lot of this stuff, like the humor in the repugnant or the off-putting or just the downright tragic. There does have to be some form of laughing at it, or we'll cry the whole time.
So Slit delivers what is one of the very few pieces of expositional dialogue in the entire film, because he tells us what's going on.
Treason! Betrayal! An imperator gone rogue!
An imperator? Who?
Furiosa! She took a lot of stuff from Immortan Joe!
What stuff?
Breeders! He's prized breeders! He wants them back! Got a hand laid on them!
So now we know what this movie is about.
Yeah. And that's all we need. Breeders. Got it. Got it. Yeah.
And then we see all of the war boys, again, with this V8 symbol, I think is what it's called, lifting their hands above their heads before this giant tower of steering wheels. And I will say, if you want to just pause this and look at the steering wheels, you could spend 10, 15 minutes looking at all the details here. Yeah. And I wanted to talk a little bit about props.
Oh, yeah.
So as we said, in 2003, they got a warehouse in Sydney. This was a huge empty warehouse. And basically they had rules, which is everything has to come from somewhere. This is all found material. So they spent tons of time in the junkyard. And then one of the other rules was everything has to have a story behind it. It has to be made for a reason. And one of the big ideas that George Miller had was, he said, people always think in like a post-apocalyptic world or when there's poverty that people don't have the energy or the time to care about aesthetics. And he was like, no, human beings, whatever their circumstances are in any place in the world, are always going to try to make things a little bit more beautiful. And so he wanted all of these objects to not only have a story, but also be objects of art. And so we have all these super talented, builders who are just finding things and building things with these stories. And there's so much, just the steering wheels. There's so much here that you can look at, that you can see some creative human. And again, that's why this is a collaborative endeavor.
Yeah.
Some creative human spent a couple of hours, maybe a couple of days building this one thing, and it was special to them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And
yeah,
when you got a film that's this, how can I say this? This is an auteur-driven film.
Totally.
You want to have people who have that element into the things that they're creating, you know, that kind of artistry. And that adds in a subconscious way to the viewer's experience of how authentic this world is and how it's being created.
And it sounds like for these guys, all these people who were just in this warehouse building shit for years, that this was literal heaven. Like this is like someone's going to let me do whatever crazy things pop into my mind and build it and make it real. That's kind of amazing.
It's very reminiscent of all those guys working at early ILM on the original Star Wars.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Totally. And actually, just as for some moments, hopelessly, because that was it is very close that Star Wars doesn't happen because they can't get all that stuff done, and it's obviously really close that Fury Road doesn't happen because this movie's going to get shut down before it's finished. So yeah. So Slit goes and grabs one of the steering wheels, and Nux tries to take it from him.
That's my wheel. I'm driving. You're my Lancer. I just promoted myself. Not today. Today is my day. Look at you. If you can't stand up, you can't do war.
You can't do war. It's so great.
I mean, I think that is, mostly true. I don't know, John, you served in the military. I don't know if they had any rules like that. But.
Well, it all depends on what you do. You could lay down as a sniper, I suppose, but you do have to stand and run away at some point. So, yeah.
I'm not staying here dying soft.
There's a culture here, an entire culture and religion with the War Boys that is not going to be explained to us, but is really, really clearly set up in this moment.
As I think Brendan pointed this out, you did maybe, Steve, like when he's putting on that plastic armor or whatever, there's medals on there, right? So this guy clearly was possibly a general in the past, or very possibly a private who's lying, or a sergeant who's lying about all the things he did in the wars, but puts medals on himself because he needs to promote himself and make people believe these things. That's Immortan Joe. So he's constructed a commune or a cult type of existence, but with an overly masculine, toxic masculine energy to it, right? The Proud Boys, or the War Boys rather, the War Boys are all like,
there it is. It's right there.
The War Boys are all covered in white, and they're all in service of him. But that interaction you just saw is all about masculinity. I'm not going to die soft. I'm going to die. I'm a war boy. I want to die in a battle. I want to die in a war. And so that's that energy of like, oh, this is the only way to be a man. You can only be a man by doing these things. But of course, he's manipulated them to feel this way so they can be in service of him consistently from birth. And so this is something that you see that is quite corrosive, but of course it leads to his awakening of the things that he has been fed from the society that he was grown up in.
And as the details of this ethos kind of get doled out throughout, you as the viewer stack them on top of each other. There's this information you're getting here, and then shortly after, we're going to see the point where they spray the chrome on their mouths. They talk about Valhalla. There's the Witness Me. It all builds and builds, and then we'll talk about it in the future. But the really wonderful moment of Nux speaking to Immortan Joe, and you really feel the impact of this religion. Right? It feels like anything where the full, if you watched The Last Temptation of Christ or whatever, and you saw someone in devotion to Jesus in that film, you would get it immediately, right? Yeah. And you get it in that moment with Nux and Immortan Joe, and it's because everything's been layered. It's been layered. It's been layered. It's been layered. So when it pays off, you haven't been told it. No one gave you a document and said, here, read this about the religion of the War Boys, but you get it.
And this is really the second of the great themes in the film. The first is introduced when we discover the disappearance of the wives, and that is a feminine theme, the life force and the protection of the life force and what that means. And now we have a masculine theme, which is the susceptibility of young men to powerful leaders that challenge their masculinity and their willingness to put themselves in jeopardy for the sake of that idealized masculinity and the idealized father figure, Immortan Joe, you know? Yeah. And they come to the conclusion, because Nux is sickly and can't stand, well, we'll take my blood bag. We can take my blood bag and strap it into the Lancer's perch. And of course, we see Max hanging upside down in that metal mask, which just talk about insult to injury. I mean, that thing looks so damn uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And they did have, it's made, by the way, of a, you know, like a garden tool. That's where its origin is, because it is also a found object. And they fortunately had a soft one in addition to the metal one. So Tom Hardy did have to wear a metal one some of the time, but a lot of the time it was softer and more comfortable.
Tom's kind of a deceptively pretty guy who goes for the harder edges.
Oh, for
right?
sure.
I mean, that's the thing with it. If you see Tom Hardy in the early 2000s, that's a pretty man.
Mm-hmm.
And so as you see him get older, though, he gravitates to these more harder edged, or I wouldn't say ugly, but certainly dirtier type of characters, like in Warrior, and like here in this Bane, even to a degree, you know. And so you see him adjusting his face, adjusting his body. Even the character he plays in Peaky Blinders, right? He's got a little kind of edge to him, a dirtiness to him. That I think
you know, in Dunkirk, he's got his face hidden behind a mask for most of the movie, and he's talking into radio control.
He's an odd one. He's definitely one. You know,
love him.
And if you hadn't figured it out by now you really see the bloodline coming from out of his chest down to Nux, and we hear,
"It's got a muzzle on it. It's a raging feral." That's right. High octane, crazy blood filling me up. If I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die historic on the Fury Road.
And there's the title.
And I will say that moment is the end point of those 12 minutes that I said to you. I think this is the true master stroke of the film is this section. And it's not to undercut anything that's later to come, because of course all these chases are phenomenal, and everything that goes along from here is just builds and builds and builds, and the narrative momentum is fantastic, and they just sustain it for 2 hours, just unbelievable. But you know, John, you're going to understand this the most, I think, that when you watch a pro wrestling match, there is.
Although Steve is a recent convert, so
okay, very good. So, but I will say this for anyone
only Lucha Libre, only in Mexico.
Well, this is a great, but Lucha is a perfect example of this, then, Steve, because what is the most spectacular thing about Lucha Libre are all the high spots, right?
Yes,
they're fantastic, almost aerialists, and you know, you're really going for the event, right? And you're going to see a spectacular, right? But if it's just high spots, it means nothing, and the character has to be there, the story has to be there, and as I said, he has created in this 12 minutes something that could populate an entire feature film, so that you could then launch off for that to another movie that's a full action set piece. He does it here in this concise 12 minutes, and we just talked about it for an hour. Like, it's miraculous.
Part of, I think, where it comes from is this is shot in sequence. And actually, the Citadel is the only stuff that's shot out of sequence. So this is actually shot at the end. But everything else is shot in sequence. And if you're going to shoot stuff in sequence, you actually need all the actors and everybody there all the time, which is totally inefficient in terms of budgeting and schedule, because you don't want to have all these people sitting around. But because you did have everyone there for 7 months, you got to create you had time to create all these relationships and all these connections, so that when you see it in these 12 minutes, which was shot at the end of the film, the relationship with Nux and Slit, I mean, it's there. Everything is there. They have figured it all out. And then we cut to outside, and we have our first glimpse of this armada of fucking vehicles belonging to the Immortan Joe, every one of them more fascinating to the last. And of course, we have Mad Max strapped to the front of the car, driving through the dust, the mask across his face. And at this moment, as we're chasing off after Furiosa across the desert, I think, believe it or not, it is time to end part one of what will be, I'm just going to say it right now, the greatest deep dive into Mad Max Fury Road ever attempted by humankind.
Well, I hope to do more than attempt. I'd like to throw two things out there to anyone listening to this that wants to kind of maybe think of the movie in these terms as you go forward. For one, something that you said about the development of this, Steve, I think becomes very important. And it's that before he moved into the idea of making this as a movie, they were trying to develop a Mad Max television series.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that plays such a huge role in how this movie is paced. And we will get into it to the minute when we go forward with this, because there is some real television demarcation in this movie. And the other thing that I would love for people to think about, especially if they're going to watch the movie again, is the romance aspect of it. I believe this movie is one of the great romances and one of my favorite romances in terms of filmed romantic movies. I really, truly believe that. And I believe it's core to the appeal of the movie. I think that's why so many people do love it. And it kind of crosses demographics, genders. There's a lot of love for this movie. And I think whether it's conscious or subconscious, the romance has a lot to do with it.
Well, I think these are two perfect things for folks listening to the Cine-Files to discuss on social media. We'll put up links on our Facebook page. Just do a search for the Cine-Files. You can find us at Cine_Files on Twitter, the Cine-Files podcast on Instagram. And if you want to subscribe to the show, you know all the subscribing places, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify. Please leave your reviews if you haven't done so already. You can support the show, as we already mentioned, on patreon.com/thecine-files, as well as on Apple Podcasts. And you can buy or stream Fury Road along with every other movie we've ever reviewed on cinephiles.net. And if you want to reach me, it's SR Morris on Twitter, SR Morris1 on Instagram. And I am also SR Morris on Blue Sky. I'm working on it. I'll get there. We'll start doing stuff there too. John, how will people reach you?
Hey, you can always reach me at The Rocha Says on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, The Outlaw Nation on Twitch, my YouTube channel, and Blue Sky, at The Rocha Says on Blue Sky as well. And my YouTube channel, youtube.com/John Rocha Says. We can see all the reviews, reactions, and my other shows that I do, like the Hot Mic, the Geek Buddies, the Jedi Way, assorted other things there as well.
Now, Brendan, my memory is that you're not a social media guy, but I still would highly recommend everybody who hasn't listened to WTF with Marc Maron that they should absolutely check it out. There are literally, 1,500 interviews?
Yeah, over 1,600 now, yeah.
Over 1,600 interviews. Wow. They are fantastic and well worth your time. And Brendan, thank you so much for coming back on the Cine-Files.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan.
Thank you, guys. Look forward to going further down the road.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to do that right here next week for part 2. I doubt we're going to conclude it in 2. We'll see if we get it done in 3, but that's more Fury Road coming next week on the Cine-Files.